Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Zoom room where we're going to be talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, engagement, belonging, all of those things that should make us feel good and make the people that we work with feel good and authentic and just valued. So we have with us three really incredible thought leaders in this space. DaWon Baker from Colorado, Sheridan Blanford from Washington, and then we have Thomas Harris from Arizona. So we're going to ask them some questions, get some advice, some thoughts. There are going to be opportunities for you all to ask some questions towards the end of our time together. But we're going to dive right into this and really hear what they have to say and some nuggets that they can drop for you all as you're navigating through your spaces as well. So this first question is for DaWon. We're going to talk a little bit about leading in this space from the top down. So DaWon, what does it mean to have DEI come from the athletic director, from the person at the top? What does that look like within an athletic department? And then if you have any examples that you can provide for the group to put some meat to the potatoes, that would be awesome too.
Absolutely. First, thanks for being here, and thank you for your commitment to not only being better leaders, but making our industry better. So I definitely appreciate you all being here, and want to say thanks to TopConnect AD as well for inviting us. But for me, I think when I think about what it looks like for a leader as somebody who is kind of at the executive level or getting to the AD chair, the first thing that I think is really, really important is when you're getting into these positions or when you are finally accepting one of these positions, you can set the tone immediately by making this a part of what your introduction looks like as AD. So when you're doing your introductory press conference, or when you're making your rounds with the individuals across campus or within the department, making that a part of your message, I think is really, really foundational, and lets people know when you're coming into the door, oh, this is going to be a priority for our new AD, right? And that gives a lot of signals to make sure that they're now jumping on board if that's something that you want your athletic department to be really, really invested in. I'd also add, if you can integrate it into everything that you do in some way, shape, or form, specifically in a hiring perspective, and Thomas is going to talk a little bit about that once we kind of transition through, so I'll leave that to him. But things that you can do to make sure that it's a part of what you do in regards to your evaluations. So as an AD, when you're emerging, you're obviously going to be dealing with coaches and staff members who might have contracts you're going to be evaluating essentially, if more than likely on an annual basis, but even on a daily basis. Embedded what DEI looks like into what that contract or what that job responsibility looks like. It can be something that's easy or an easy caveat, such as, are you maintaining an inclusive environment within your department? All of our coaches' contracts are going to have something in there about ethics or something about maintaining the integrity of the department or the university. You can even take that a step further with your legal team and say, hey, is there anything that we can add that says, I want my team or I want my coaches to really be developing a culture that celebrates diversity or practices inclusion on a daily basis. So that way, if something ever does pop up, similar to what Jeremy was saying earlier, or what Rendell was saying earlier, you now have it built into what that system is and how it is that you're evaluating those coaches and those staff members to say, hey, I feel like this person stepped over the line in this specific way. When it comes to creating an inclusive environment, how can we ratify that? How can we rectify that, in a timely basis? Other things that come to mind for me as far as being a top-down person or being a top-down leader is you got to be the mouthpiece. A lot of our leaders within college athletics know this is important, but wrestle with how to talk about it, how to actually put some practice behind it. I would say that's not an excuse to not be engaged in it. You have to be the mouthpiece, and you have to bolster up the efforts by making sure it's something that you talk about every single time. You're going to be in your head coaches meetings, you're going to be in your department head meetings. Create a standing agenda item that every single time you meet with your exec group, your department heads, your head coaches, that is something that you're talking about, is something that's discussing, because then it will become commonplace, and making sure that everybody else is discussing it as well. And the last couple of things I'll add is make sure that it's really, really embedded into what you do as an AD as well. When you're emerging into the AD spot, you're going to know who your chancellor, your president is. I would suggest also meeting with your CDO or whoever the head diversity and inclusion individual is for your campus. Get to know them very well, because they will tell you from a campus perspective, oh, these are the things that we're looking at on campus. And then you can go and carry that back to whoever is leading these efforts for your athletic department if you're not leading them yourselves. And so if you're going through the interview process and you're talking to your chancellor, your president, the person who will be hiring you, ask them, hey, what's the relationship like with the CDO on campus, with the chief diversity officer, the chief inclusion officer, and making sure that you have that dialogue with them, or having a standing meeting with them as well, the same way that you would be meeting with the cabinet. And so I think those are some ways that you can be really, really effective and make this really, really vital to what it is that you do as a leader in your organization.
Thanks, DaWon. A lot of really good pieces of advice there, good perspective. Some of the things I was hearing was setting expectations, but also walking the talk, right? There's a quote that I love: the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And so what does that look like? It's one thing to say it, it's another thing to do it, and then a third thing to actually implement that and expect that from everybody else. And so I think that's great. It's culture, what you're talking about, right? Is setting an expectation of culture, behavior, attitude, all of those things that should be embodying what it means to be a part of whatever athletic department you're in. So, some of that walks us into what Sheridan's going to talk about in terms of accountability and what that looks like, right? There's one thing to say it, but then how do you hold people accountable to actually do it? So Sheridan, the question for you: what does belonging mean in college athletics? What does that look like? And then how can people who are in positions of influence, how can leaders in the spaces create systems of accountability surrounding the work that we're trying to do in order to create these environments of belonging? What does that look like for you?
Absolutely. I'll second DaWon's sentiments and just really want to thank you all for being here, but inviting us to be a part of this space. Great way to, I guess, be a part of a Friday. I say good morning or good afternoon, contingent on where you are, but just really excited to be here. So to start off, I think we really need to define what does belonging mean. So in the spirit of Sheridan, if you know anything about me, I love some activities, but we're just going to do a small visualization activity. So if everyone, I know everyone just got done eating lunch or had a second cup of coffee, but close your eyes, please. Thank you. You can only see some faces, but it looks like we're engaged. So thank you. Take a deep breath. And I want you to think about a place, go to a place in your head where you can show up and just be your most authentic self. You can wear what you want to wear. You can say what you need to say. You can think what you want to think. You don't have to be perfect. You just got to show up and just be you. What is that place? Where are you? What makes that place so comforting for you? And who's in that place? Who's around you? All right, everyone can open your eyes. Thank you. So I'll share. I know for me, that place for me is at my home in Colorado. I can have my PJs on. I can have my bonnet on. I can wear whatever I want to wear. I can eat whatever I want to eat. I can say whatever I need to say and still feel or still know that I'm going to be loved, that I feel respected, that I'm going to be heard, all the things, like show up and be the best version of Sheridan. And when you're visualizing that place, that's a place of belonging where you can just quite literally show up and just be you. So you can show up as your genuine self. You can feel that you're loved and cared for. You can kind of show up without fear of making mistakes or pushing against the norm, challenging where you're at. And how we equate belonging is to psychological safety. So that is being able to show up, feel that you can push against the norm, and then also make mistakes. And I'd be interested to hear, if we had more time to have a conversation, how many of you, when you went into that place, thought of a work environment? I'm going to argue that not a lot of people thought about that. And while, we're not going to, again, show up in our PJs and bonnet and kick our feet up, we are trying to create that same type of mental stability and mental comfort in the spaces that we're creating in athletics. So we want people to be able to show up and just be them. So how we do that is a lot of organizations and departments, I think that DaWon and Thomas and I, and then a lot of you have been a part of, think that they're doing a better job of this than they actually are. And so what I want to do is just provide a few very tangible things about how we can get people to a place of belonging or psychological safety. So I'm going to use the model, the effective problem solving model by DR Works, to kind of break down 5 specific areas of how we can think about creating long-standing sustainable change and impact in our spaces. And the first part of this is awareness. So over the last year, unless you are quite literally living under a rock, and since you all are here, you're not living under a rock, we have been exposed to the fact that we have a lot of work to do in this space, more than a lot of us probably gave ourselves credit for. So I really think that awareness is the first piece. But then what often happens is people just jump from awareness to action. It's like, okay, we recognize there's a problem, now let's fix it. But there's a few steps missing within that. So after awareness, which is our first kind of point of the effective problem solving model, is information gathering and analysis. So back to kind of what I was just sharing is there's a handful of people or organizations that say, you know, we're inclusive and we accept diversity and we lead with equity and we have policies and procedures and practices and et cetera to create those environments. And my response to that always is, how do you know? What data, what information do you have to support that, what you're saying? And with that, I think we really need to start within this space of DE&I, just like we do within the fundraising space, the marketing space, everything. We need to use data. We need to pride ourselves on data-informed decisions. So we need to get feedback from our stakeholders. We need to create various mechanisms in order to do this. So yes, just walking up to someone and saying, tell me about your experience might work with one person, it might not work with another person. And that's based off of, again, psychological safety, trust, feelings of belonging. So we have to create various tools and mechanisms to really evaluate where we are, both from a quantitative. So we got to get real and say, if we're trying to increase our numbers within racial diversity or gender diversity, like we got to know where we're at. And in that same breath, we need to think about quantitative data, but then also qualitative data. So you got to be able to hear people, how they're experiencing it past just a, you know, rank this survey strongest, you know, strongly agree to strongly disagree, kind of that scale. So, and then that's going to help you know where you are. You can't know where you are going if you don't know where you're starting from. So from there, the third component of this is vision and planning. There's one of my favorite quotes is by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. And again, like we do with all of our other departments within athletics, within development, with marketing, with student athlete development, with compliance, we put plans in place to wrap our arms around where we're trying to go. And again, jumping from that awareness to action is there's not often a plan, which can allow things to fall through the cracks and not create consistency. So create a plan. And then again, back to that feedback, you have to be willing to hear. If you're asking for someone to tell you about their experience, you have to be able to not only hear it, but then do something about it. So then that takes us into the fourth component of this, which is the action piece. So after you've kind of analyzed where you're at, where you need to go, you've put a plan in place to create consistency within that, you got to take action. You got to test it out. You got to see if it works. And then from there, the last component is kind of this reflection and evaluation. I think we do that well in portions of athletics, but this is a space where we have to get a lot better at. And it goes back to, again, if you're going to ask for feedback, you're going to ask about people's experiences, you're going to ask how they are experiencing your leadership, your culture, the people that are in your department, you have to be willing and ready to receive it. And I genuinely say from the bottom of my heart, and I know a lot of us who work in this space consistently feel that way, is this is the most difficult part of this work. You have to get real and raw with really understanding people's experiences. Because yes, we can celebrate Heritage Months and we can put out great graphics and we can create specific affinity groups to make sure people feel that they belong and can find community. But when you ask somebody about their experience and they're honest, you have to be able to hear that and then you have to be able to do something with it. So there's kind of that cycle, but it is a cycle in a way that there's not a, hey, step 1 to step 5, and when you get to step 5, you're done. It's consistent. So when you get to that evaluation piece, you're then going to recognize that there's a new problem. And then you're going to go to analyze what the problem is. And then you're going to put in a plan, and then you're going to take action, and then you're going to reevaluate. So it's a really big cycle. And when you continue on that cycle, that's what's going to create accountability. So that's how I like to break it down. I hope that makes sense for folks.
Thank you, Sheridan. Appreciate that. And it does, right? You're right. It's an never-ending cycle because we're people. We always evolve, things evolve, times evolve, situations, circumstances change, and we have to be able to change with them. That is the nature of college athletics, and everything we do. It's also the same thing we do in things that kind of make us uncomfortable. But you know, a lot of what you're talking about in terms of having something in place, when I think of that, I think of the infrastructure. You've got to have the infrastructure to support the people that you're bringing in to your organization. So Thomas is going to talk to us a little bit about the recruitment, the retention piece, what that looks like as you're going out and you're bringing people in. You know, my biggest thing is like, don't recruit people that you can't coach. When I talk to coaches, don't recruit that kid doesn't fit within your system. So be very careful about the people that you're bringing in and understand and be honest about where you are within your athletic department and what you can maintain. So Thomas, talk to us a little bit about the phases of acquisition when you're recruiting someone. What does that look like? Why is it so important that we look at the process from beginning to end? Like holistically, what does that do and how does that impact our organization, our department, our end game with what we're trying to do with our human resources?
Yeah, thank you. And I'll echo my colleagues' points. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having us. My role is one of the very few in college athletics that is tied to our HR department. There's a lot of folks who will say DEI should not live within HR. In certain settings, I could say that's probably true, but I can tell them that it works for us. And if you do it right, it could work for you. And so the recruitment pipeline, talent pipeline, however you want to call it. I do a lot of presenting on this, and there's 4 phases that we walk through, and that's pre-recruiting, attracting talent, screening and selection, and onboarding. The first phase, pre-recruiting, that's when you have to take awareness of what you have and what's going on in your department. So what talent do you have? What resources do you have? And then as Brandi was talking about, who should fit into that? And so I don't really like the word fit. I go for contribution or complement. And so once you do, the awareness of what you have left over, now you need to figure out what your candidate needs to bring to your team to make your team better. And so sometimes fit means the same. And so that's why I go with contribution or complement. And so also in this phase, you want to talk about the budget. So make sure you're posting your salary range. Diverse candidates want to know how much is going to be offered in their role. So go ahead and post that salary range. Also post if you're going to be allowing moving expenses. Moving from state to state, across the country, whatever the case may be, can get really expensive. And if it's someone who comes from a low SES background and just getting started in their career, maybe they still have a little debt that they're trying to get rid of, they won't move unless they know that moving expenses will be covered. So make sure that's explained in your job description. Also in your job description, be creative. Stay away from non-inclusive language. Stay away from must be able to lift 50 pounds. And, in most of these roles, people don't lift 50 pounds. We have hand trucks and different things like that, dollies and golf courts to kind of get things around. So you're excluding folks who may not be confident in their strength when you post things like that. And research has found that minority candidates, marginalized candidates, they will be turned off by job descriptions. So make sure you're staying away from masculine words. Don't say he, she, say they, say individual, those types of things. Also, that's when you get started with your search committee members. Who's going to be a part of your search committee? I've seen many search committees that have 4 people, 5 people total, 4 people come from that department that's being hired. That's not going to yield you great results. That's going to yield you that fit person, which is going to look like those other 4. So make sure you have diversity when it comes to the positions within your organization on your search committee. Also, maybe even use a community member or a campus university side member as well. Second phase, attracting talent. This is when a lot of people say, well, we don't hire minority candidates because they don't apply for our jobs. That couldn't be further from the truth. And so a lot of times, if that is the truth, what are you doing to make sure that you are creating a diverse candidate pool? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But some easy ways to do that is networking. I tell all of our hiring managers, have you reached out to someone in your industry who doesn't look like you? If the answer is no, then you need to do that. If you don't know someone, then you need to work on that. So if you're not reaching out to people who don't look like you, that's going to be hard to create a diverse talent pool. So doing that, you can ask that person if they're interested. If not, ask them if they know someone who's interested. Also, social media. If you're posting about a job on social media, don't just post what's on the job description. Post something that's personal. Like, people will be attracted to you if you're going to say, hey, come work for me. These are some of the things that you're going to be able to do during your time here at this institution. Those things kind of have a personal touch, and people are more attractive to those. Also, job boards. Don't just post on NCAA or D1 Ticker. Post on MOA. In Arizona, we have ArizonaDiversity.com. I'm sure that's like that in a few different states. So look at some of those diversity-based job boards as well to kind of create that diverse talent pool too. Third phase is how we attract talent. And so we're talking about reviewing qualifications and deciding who makes that interview cut. Make sure that you're documenting your decisions. Why is this person getting interviewed? Why is this person not? Because that's where that kind of, we get into that space where we end up with 4 candidates who all look the same. But you have other candidates who may be from a diverse background that have the same qualifications, but for some reason, they never get those interviews. So make sure you're documenting those decisions and make sure your reasoning makes sense and that you're being fair and equitable throughout your entire process. We also talk through interview planning with this, so make sure you have some really good interview questions. Allow your search committee to give you feedback on some questions. Use your campus HR team to steal some questions from them. And then also, once you get to that point, we want to talk through timing and format. Make sure you're being cognizant of people who are on different coasts than you, and then reference checks. As well go into this. Make sure you're doing your due diligence. A lot of times people only do reference checks when they know who the candidate that they want. But sometimes if you have 2 or 3 really good candidates, you can reach out to those references and just check up on them. Because I think a lot of times also diverse candidates get put out of the searches because they don't do the reference checks. And then lastly is onboarding. I can make a case that onboarding starts even before the first phase, but just the last part, make sure you have a plan. Make sure you show some of your best stuff. Make sure you're being honest. Create a buddy. I'm a part of the HR team, but also what I do is I meet with our new hires on their first day. I take them around campus on a golf cart. I take them to go get their CAT card, which is their campus ID. I take them to certain buildings that make sense. If they're a coach, I tell them about our cultural and resource centers and different things like that. And then also creating that sense of belonging on the first day. We have an athletic softball team that competes in the city, so I talk about that. We play basketball in our morning gym, just staff only, so I talk to people about that. Talk about some of that fun stuff, our lunch and learns, our wellness Wednesdays, some of the programming that we have. And then, so that's the 4, and then obviously the next step is retention and developing your people. Once you get them in, don't forget about them. Make sure you're checking in on them. Make sure you're developing them, giving them money to go do professional development, whatever the case may be. Having those one-on-one conversations about how they can improve, what they're doing great. Ask them for feedback. All of that good stuff as well. I can talk on and on about this. I do a full 1-hour presentation, but it's really important that all hiring managers go through some sort of recruitment and retention training. A lot of times people make mistakes because they don't know how to hire, and all they've been doing is passing down bad information, and their entire pipeline is doing it wrong. So make sure people are going through these trainings.
Thanks, Thomas. And, thanks, DaWon, for putting some other resources in the chat. We appreciate that. And as you all have questions, please feel free to engage in the chat as well. So, what Thomas was talking about is incredibly important because so often, whether we do it or not, right, or on purpose, we have biases. We all walk into our spaces and our places with whatever, luggage and baggage that we're carrying around with us every day. And so, you have a lot of times where people want to either go for comfort or go for familiarity, or, just literally people rather than opening up your minds to getting somewhere that, someone who may push you outside of the box. So appreciate all of the tidbits that you all have given us thus far. And now this next question is for the group. So like anything, DE&I is not new, shouldn't be new, but we're definitely talking about it more. You see a lot more athletic departments that are intentionally hiring people for these spaces. And, we could get into a whole other thing about that and that whole process, but happy to see it happening regardless, right? Happy to see the lane having been created so that we can start actually doing some work and putting our money where our mouth is, not only for our staff, but for our student athletes as well. But, like anything, when things come up, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, just in general, right? Like what's happening to our Asian American Pacific Islander friends, like it's just, sometimes, unfortunately, it takes disastrous moments and really unfortunate moments in our country, in our society, within our world of athletics to then spark a, oh, well, maybe we should. And with that comes all of the other buzzwords that people then cling on to and then hold on to and try to say, well, this is how we fix these things. And these are the only things that need to be fixed. And that's what you continue to hear. So, you know, unconscious bias, microaggressions, privilege, those concepts have been thrown out a lot over the last almost year now. And I don't know that there's a lot behind it, you know, it just sounds good. And sometimes people know that it might be important, but there's really no education in terms of how we fix some of those things at work in our spaces. So this question is for the whole group. How do we take those words, those buzzwords that we hear? How do we take them and like operationalize fixing that stuff, right? So like number one, let's talk about what it looks like. So what do microaggressions look like? What does unconscious bias look like? What does privilege look like at work in the workplace? And then do you have some tips on how we tackle fixing some of those things, educating ourselves, creating better spaces for us to be able to navigate around, one, acknowledging them, and then two, how we then work together to move forward and grow from them and not continue to compound them. So I will open this up, ladies first. So Sheridan, if you'd like to lead us off, and then DaWon and then Thomas, if you'd like to share what you have as well.
Awesome. I was going to tell DaWon to go first, but I'll go first. Nonetheless, it was interesting, Brandi, as we were preparing for this. It was like, okay, how are we going to operationalize and really share examples? Like, what example are we going to use? And the fact that all three of us, as people who identify as people of color with different underrepresented identities, could go through so many different things that we've seen and experienced, it's alarming. And I think that with that, it's almost hard to like break down, because there's just, it happens so much and it's baked into so many things, and what's we've defined as normal, that goes back to one of the things I was talking about when we're analyzing and really trying to listen to our people and taking in their feedback about how we experience things. We have to do that genuinely and honestly. But one of the first things I'll say about these quote unquote buzzwords is to be surprised to say I've asked what feels like 1 million people to define these words. And everyone has a different definition for what these words are and how they show up. And people use them interchangeably. People will just use them to sound like they know what they're talking about, but can't back that up to translate that to show what it actually means. And not only to be able to define it, but to show how it shows up, and maybe in times how they've perpetuated it. I think that we also got to get real with ourselves and think about, even as the person who does this work and get paid to do it every single day, how my bias, how I've microaggressed, how my privilege, being able-bodied and being a heterosexual woman and being a cisgender woman, and like there's just so many things about how my bias shows up. So people really understanding what the words actually mean, and then being able to get real with themselves and understanding how these things translate. But just some very concrete examples that have come up recently, just to kind of break down some real things that have happened, is really thinking about with some of your underrepresented folks, particularly in your senior leadership spaces, are how they're interacting with donor spaces. A lot of times donor spaces are not diverse. I would argue that almost all of them are not diverse. Therefore, when you are thinking about having these spaces and trying to make them more inclusive, one, before you even start thinking about how your people experience it, we got to do a better job at diversifying who we are partnering with from a resource and financial standpoint, like full stop. The second component of that is we have to have a standard for who we partner with. Yes, someone might want to sign $1 million check, and that's great, but if their standards don't match up with what you and your university and your department are standing on, then is that money worth it? That's what I'll ask. And then the third component is that's when you really start to focus on your people. You got to make sure that you're very intentional, as Thomas was saying. As soon as they get in the door, that's great, but make sure that you're continuously checking in on people and changing what that norm is, asking in this donor space, in this football game, what are the conversations we're talking? What are the conversations we're having? What's normal? What something as simple as like, what food are we eating? What wine are we drinking? Is that something that everyone's familiar and comfortable with? The answer is going to be no. And then for you to then determine, does this feel normal to me? Why does it feel normal to me? Is this something that I have been exposed to when we're going golfing? Your girl can't golf to save her life, but I know that that's something that, you know, my family didn't golf. I didn't grow up in a space that golf to play golf, but that's just a very explicit example in how we're redefining norms and thinking about how we can make those spaces more inclusive, being intentional about that. And then the second component, then I'll kick it to DaWon and Thomas, is really kind of bringing in what you're talking about, Brandi, about this whole notion of all the social justice that we've been exposed to, whether we were ready for it or not in the last year. And I had a student athlete so wisely say, your ability to ignore something equates to ignorance. A lot of us would say that we're not ignorant. I would like to think I'm not ignorant, but I am, because there are certain things, again, with the advantaged or privileged identities that I have, that I'm able to ignore. And yes, while you as the leader, it might be incredibly uncomfortable for you, you might not know what to say, you might not know how to navigate, I want you to then take that in to really understand and think about, if I have the ability to ignore this or kind of place my discomfort over how other people might be feeling, how does that translate into people feeling that they belong, feeling like they're respected, feeling like they're psychologically safe, feeling like they're seen? So those are two kind of concrete examples that I probably surround kind of this like privilege and or just bias and how we experience things and how we show up. But again, I could go on and 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 on. That goes back to me really pushing people to evaluate the cultures that you're a part of and really ask people how they're experiencing them. I'll stop.
Thank you, Sheridan. DaWon?
Yeah, so I have a specific example related to microaggressions. And this point is more so to your point of Brandi, like how does this show up, or how do we operationalize it, or how does what our staff knows about that, how it shows up, and how we do everything. And so when I first got to my current institution at Colorado, a few months back, we did a survey and we asked our student athletes and our staff about this idea of colorblindness, right? And that wasn't something that Brandi mentioned specifically, but I think this is one of the things that is pretty heavy and people are starting to learn about. And we asked our staff and our student athletes, do you see color? And I'm not going to give you the specific number, but I would say a very large number of our student athletes and staff said, no, we don't see color. And the way that kind of operationalizes to me, or how it starts to pop up, is it says, okay, if we don't see it, how do we notice who our staff is, who's reflected in our staff, how we need to do better from a recruitment and a retention standpoint? Do we know the percentage of the people that are leaving and what their racial background is, or even if we take it further to gender or their sexual identity, et cetera? If we don't know what those things are, how can we accurately really measure it? And so for somebody who's coming into the organization, who's really new and whose task is to kind of develop these plans in regards to what DEI looks like for our athletic department, it put me specifically in a space, or put me in a space almost immediately to say, okay, I need to go and talk to who our hiring managers are. I need to talk to my AD and say, hey, in this information that we gathered, there's something that's missing here. Because that the vast majority of our people, I wouldn't say don't understand it, but have a different perspective on it, we then need to think about, okay, if they don't have the perspective on it, how does that play into how it operationalizes into the rest of the things that we do? And so because we don't understand or don't have a good perspective on what colorblindness is, when we're hiring or when we have somebody that's coming into, our doors, and we're not mentioning anything about, hey, race is important here, gender is important here, sexual identity is important here. And if we're not saying that within the process, then how do we know that we're actually going to be able to recruit and retain this person? Because that might be something important to them. And so that was a specific example that's happened to me more recently. And it's forced us to have more conversations about, okay, how do we start to have these conversations on an everyday level, compared to just ask them in a survey and then ask them again, a year later to see if we did our 2 or 3 sessions and they understand it now. Are we really having those intimate conversations, not just with ourselves, but even with our HR across campus, and say, hey, can you send us the breakdown of who's applying to our jobs, so that we can say, oh, we noticed that our state demographics might look this way, but we're severely lacking in regards to the number of people who are applying to our jobs from this specific demographic. Where's the gap that we have? And because we are asking those specific questions now, we can then go into Sheridan's previous point and actually look at real data and saying, hey, even if we aren't recruiting at a specific clip, we're getting better because last year, only 13% of our applicants came from underrepresented background, whereas this year it's 18%. And if we can get that specific data, it helps us operationalize what some of these words actually mean and how it is that they show up in our day-to-day interactions. I hope that was as clear as I could make it. If it's not clear, I'm more than happy to provide even more examples to be able to show what that looks like for us.
Yeah, thank you, DaWon. You know, that question always kills me, right? Like, I think I get where people are saying like, oh no, I don't see color. It's safe. It almost says like, I'm not a racist, but that's not the question, right? Like, of course you see color. Like, what color is my shirt? Everybody sees color. It's you may not judge people based on the color of their skin. That is understandable, but we have to all agree, like, yes, we all see color, unless you're colorblind, even then you still just see two colors maybe. But, you know, it's one of those things where I feel like it's a safety mechanism sometimes. Like if I answer this one way, then maybe they're going to think I'm racist. If I don't, then they'll understand that I'm not. And that's not the impetus of the question, right? So I am glad though that it helped you catapult some different kinds of conversations, breaking some stuff down and really open the door for that. Thomas, give us what you've got in this space. What does that look like for you at Arizona?
Yeah, so I'll try to wrap it up with all three of these buzzwords and kind of just use an example. I'm going to put my male ally to women hat on really quickly and use an example for all three of these. So with bias, a lot of times what I've heard from the women in my department is that they're overlooked for certain opportunities. They're overlooked for certain promotions. And, you know, that trend just looks like sometimes that happens because we're women. And so a lot of times what happens is if you have a male supervisor, there could be some bias towards hiring another male, promoting another male, and not looking at the woman that is in your department who's been killing it for years on years. And for whatever reason, the supervisor just feels more comfortable hiring a male and having a male as the right person. And so making sure that we're establishing that that's not something that we want to do. It creates a non-inclusive environment, but also what are the parameters for promotions, for growth, for development, and making sure that everyone has an equitable opportunity when it comes to that. When it comes to microaggressions, and if you don't know what those are, just putting it simple, a lot of people call it death by 1,000 cuts. So it's just those little subtle jabs that people get hit with every day, marginalized folks get hit with every day, that may seem small, may seem like a joke at first, but once you get 100 jokes, that's no longer a joke, and it affects your mental health. It affects everything that you do within the workplace. Oftentimes, and I say often very, very carefully, they're unconscious and they're unintentional. But that's only one time. Once you make that unconscious mistake the first time, it's not unconscious after that. So that's important for people to understand. And so for women, what I've heard is they're mansplained to, they're talked over in meetings. They will literally say an idea in a meeting, and then a man would come behind them and say, oh, we should do this, this is this, and just reword how the woman just said it. And so those are microaggressions. Those things add up to people. And like I said, it messes with your mental health. It messes with your work performance and different things like that. And then lastly, privilege. I know a lot of people don't like the term white privilege. So I'm going to show you a different type of privilege just so you understand what that means. And so using privilege to combat whatever it is that your identity is the majority in is the important piece to privilege. And so I'm going to use myself as male privilege in this example. When it comes to these things, these microaggressions that I see in meetings, I have the privilege to speak up and say, oh, wait, X, Y, and Z, what did you just say? Could you elaborate on your point? So that makes sure that everyone understands that this was this person's original idea. And then also when microaggressions happen, maybe it's not in a meeting, and maybe someone is talking about how someone is dressed. I can step in and say, hey, Would you talk to your mom like that? Would you talk to your sister like that? Would you talk to your partner like that? Making sure that everyone understands that microaggressions and being rude to women, being rude to anyone is just not needed in our workplace, and it causes a non-inclusive environment. And so those are just the ways that I attack all three of those things. It happens in many different levels, but I hope that those examples help you understand those a little bit more and how you can get rid of that.
All right, thank you, Thomas. I, again, appreciate everything that you all have shared with the group. You know, this is always a topic that is interesting, it's necessary, but it kind of causes analysis by paralysis for some people. Like, okay, well, where do we go from here? What does that look like? What do we do? Give us a roadmap. Just tell us what to do. We don't have any questions right now. I don't think that I can see in the chat, but want to open it up before. I mean, I have some more questions that I'd like to ask the group, but want to pause for a minute and allow for anyone who's got a question for either DaWon, Sheridan, or Thomas, or all three of them, to ask now if you'd like. So we'll open up the floor and see if there are any questions out there for the three of our panelists.
Hey, Thomas, this is Tim House from Purdue. You mentioned something about, you know, when you're hiring, tapping into your network, talking to people who don't look like you, about finding other people who don't like you to create diversity within the organization as you make these hires. What's the best way to go about that conversation? I have, you know, no problem making friends who don't look like me and have plenty of them in my network, but that's kind of an uncomfortable conversation to me, if I'm just being totally honest with myself. What is the best way to approach that, in your opinion? I mean, are you just blunt about it? I mean, or how do you go about having that conversation?
Yeah, I'm in favor of being blunt. Just say, hey, look, we're looking for people who are different than our current staff. But if you don't feel comfortable with that, it's just asking them like you would ask anyone else. Just say, hey, you know, we don't know each other. We met each other at a conference, but just wanted to let you know we have this position open. Would you be interested, or do you know someone who would be interested? So I think a lot of times it is uncomfortable if you come at it like with the reasoning that you're looking for diverse candidates, and sometimes that could come off as, you know, tokenism and different things like that. But it's just like, you know, reaching out to anybody, you know, that you know, and just say, hey, we have this position, we're looking for X, Y, and Z. These are some of the qualities that we're looking for in a candidate. Would you be interested, or do you know anyone who is interested? And a lot of times people, they get ecstatic when it comes to that, and they'll offer up some of their best when people come at them genuinely like that, to say, hey, you know, I don't want this person to leave, but just because you reached out, this person could be interested. Look out for this person's resume. And I think that's the way to do it.
Awesome,
I'll jump in too quick. Sorry, just to add something, Tim. I think I had a conversation with someone at Washington recently about this, and someone who's in fundraising. So I use the example to kind of correlate, because I think it's really good to integrate how we think about these things into the processes that we're more familiar and comfortable with. But thinking about a donor, right? Like if you were going to go ask a donor, you're not going to just walk up to a donor and be like, hey, can you give me $1 million gift? There's a lot of things that have to come before that. You have to build a relationship with people. So back to Thomas's point, is like when you are comfortable and you know somebody, I would say this is Sheridan's personal opinion. That's when you can feel like, hey, this is what we're trying to do. This is, you know, why we're doing it. This is the position, being able to describe that. But there's a lot of work on the front end that has to be done to build relationships. So going back to that, like, hey, if we've never talked, Tim, I want to get to know you so that I know if I am going to give you the best and brightest that I'm connected with, I know that I'm sending them into a place where they're going to be valued, they're going to be heard, they're going to feel respected, they're going into an environment of inclusion or reaching toward inclusion. So I would say, just like you would a donor, be mindful of building relationships with people, and don't just reach out to people when you're looking for a diverse candidate pool. Talk to people, learn about people, engage with people. And then if and when that comes, I know it's coming from a genuine place. So then I would be more inclined or accepting and trying to then connect those dots if I know that I know you and I can trust whom I'm sending to you, to, you know, wrap your arms around them and make sure they're coming into an environment where they can succeed. So I would add that into, when you get to that point, be blunt, just say, this is what we're trying to do, just like you would with anything else. But be mindful of building that relationship, building that trust, building that connection, like way beforehand.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. Like you said, I mean, I would just always want them to feel like I'm approaching them because I want them to help me find the best and brightest, not taking that, coming off as being or participating in tokenism, like Thomas said. So I appreciate that feedback very much.
Yeah, and I would say also, last piece, if you know people in your industry who have similar positions like you, follow them on Twitter, follow them on social media, and see who they interact with as well. And then you could say, hey, I saw you talking to this person here who's an assistant director. We're about to hire an associate director or a director level. Could you connect me with this person that happens to?
Thanks, y'all. We have two people that have stated that they have a question. So we'll start with MACKENZIE MAGWIRE, and then we'll go to Mitch Straub. So MACKENZIE, your question?
Thank you. I'm MACKENZIE MAGWIRE. I am at University of Central Arkansas. I apologize. I'm dressed down. That's why I've had my camera off all day, but wanted to ask a question. This last year, we actually, with everything around George Floyd and all of that going on, we came together as a staff and brought together our student athletes and created a social justice committee, which is long overdue. And I was involved with it, and I loved just talking to our athletes and all of that. But since some of our athletes did an amazing job and put on some amazing programming, it really just helped a lot of us staff, our coaches and everything. But some of those athletes have either gone into the transfer portal or have moved on, and we've had a really hard time of finding some new leaders. Can you guys speak on maybe if you have any student-led things like that? Or for someone like me, I am still pretty low on our totem pole, but trying to figure out how to get more involved, but not seeming in, I don't want to sound like rude or anything, but I want to be involved, but I just don't know how to approach that, I guess, if that makes sense. Let me know if I need to clarify.
No, MACKENZIE, I think it makes sense. I would say, I think what I found to be the best way anyway is creating a mix of both your staff and your student athletes who are kind of doing these efforts, because just like you said, our student athletes are going to turn over every single year. So anything that goes into the hands of the student athletes on a consistent basis, while it might be really, really important, is going to change a lot just because there's so much turnover from the student athlete body every single year. And so I would try to approach it into the same way that you would approach like a SAC. SAC always has some type of advisor that's on the campus, and integrating it into somebody's job description to say, hey, your job is going to be to overlook and oversee our new DEI council every single year. And so it gives that person a responsibility, and it gives you and that person accountability to actually embed it into what it is that they do on a day-to-day basis. Places that you can, I think is really, really helpful to kind of gather some of those leaders is integrating it into that early onboarding process for your new student athletes. So when they're coming there for bridge or they're getting there in the fall, talking to them really, really early in June, July, August before classes start. Hey, we have this DEI council committee, et cetera. Here's why it's really, really important. We're looking for people to get involved. And essentially what you'll see happening is as freshmen, they probably won't participate, but as sophomores and juniors, when they, got their feet wet a little bit, they understand the campus, they understand the culture, they'll circle back with you. And typically that's going to be able to give you some more people who are really, really interested, but also it's not going to be something new. It's like, oh yeah, I heard about this 2 years ago when I was here, doing my onboarding or during my recruiting visit. Those would be the suggestions that I have to try to get some fresher blood in there, if you will. I would also ask your GAs for your coaching staff, because your GAs are typically fresh out, and they're probably going to have some conversations that your coaches are not going to be having with your student athletes. Ask your GAs who cares about this on their team, and they'll give you some really, really good people. At that point, then it's just about pressing them or not pressing, pushing them to get involved. But ask your GAs, because they're more than likely going to have a lot more intel than, say, your head coach would, unless your team is small or your head coach just has that good of a relationship with the student athletes where they know who's really, really invested.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, DaWon. Okay, Mitch, your question.
Hey, Mitch Straub from Washington State. My question's for Sheridan, my fellow in-state peer. Hey, Sheridan, can you talk to us a little bit about your onboarding process for current student athletes and how you implement your programming into maybe their bridge or their orientation? Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I'll just say, Mitch, go Dogs. So we're going to start with that. Where there's obviously Thomas and DaWon and I are all Pac-12. So lots of Pac-12s going on here, but great question. I will say still very new and started my job in January over COVID, which, has been presented itself to be quite interesting. So I'm still getting a lay of the land. especially when we're thinking about how we get our students like kind of integrated and knowing what's happening. So I'll be fully transparent and say that I'm still learning, but I'll do my best to kind of do my due diligence in answering your question. So from an onboarding perspective, as DaWon was just saying, I think it's really, really important to get to students early and kind of overload with information. So one, they can't say that they didn't know, but two, that way you can kind of start to remind them and get to them in a lot of different areas with what is going on and what your department offers. So having, you know, people who look like them or are represent a diverse population showing up and being present within the onboarding and summer bridge processes, things of that nature, I think is really, really important, because oftentimes our students can get, and like us in different departments too, can get super siloed in what we do. Therefore, they don't know who else is out there. They don't know who else is there to support them. So bringing a lot of different folks in to expose them to those students so they can see, you know, Mitch, like you, who's doing what you're doing, who's in different departments or different sports, that can kind of help and support and wrap their arms around them, sharing different services. I would say, again, just that exposure, as DaWon was talking about, to be able to share what resources are out there, share what, you know, student athlete affinity groups or leadership opportunities or things of that nature are present. And then I would also say, when you're thinking about, which I know a lot of us on this call, as I've worked with, talked to, partnered with, watched on Twitter do, its representation is really, really important. So as you are talking about getting your students involved and trying to get them onboarded, that offloading of all that information can feel overwhelming. So having folks who can relate to them, look like them, connect with them, can help them be able to kind of ask those questions that they might not feel comfortable just asking in a larger group. Connecting them with, again, different people from across different departments so that they feel like they kind of have their arm, we can wrap our arms around them in a lot of different ways. So those are kind of general, again, very high level, because I haven't been here to even have an onboarding process. We're going through it right now, but Mitch will connect next summer and I'll let you know what specific things that we're doing. But high level, again, just like resource sharing, making sure the students know what's out there. Having lots of different people come in and introduce themselves and show the students who's there, what's there, how to get there. And then particularly for some of your underrepresented groups, making sure that they see people that look like them, that identify like them, that they can connect with, even if it's not directly their coach or someone within their department, so that they know they have a connection and can really, really lean on someone who, you know, and as we say candidly, can break down barriers that some of us can't just by being us. So that's some of my high level thoughts.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question? And I also want to point out, thank you, Renee, for posting the information about MOA. That's another resource that all of us have access to and can utilize within the organization. It's made up of us, right? Of people that work in these spaces. So let's continue to connect with each other and utilize each other, or get familiar with organizations like MOA if you aren't already. It is an incredible resource as administrators, current and up and coming, that can ask some questions or gain some valuable information. Go ahead, Jude.
Hi, thank you. And thank you all for putting this on today. Appreciate it. So one of the questions I have, it was mentioned earlier, I think Sheridan, you talked a little bit about gathering data and getting feedback. And so I guess I'm curious as to maybe the best ways in which to do that. And the reason why I say that specifically is, you know, we offer interviews and face-to-face conversations, and the people who generally take us up on that are categorically all the same. So how do we draw out people who are a little bit more shy, who are from different, you know, backgrounds, et cetera, instead of saying, hey, come talk to us if you have an interest in the conversation, because maybe they don't have an interest. So again, I'm just curious about ways in which we can do that to really get a true assessment of the information gathering and the feedback that you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic question, Jude. And I'll just say this is one of those where you got to hit people from all angles. Everyone's going to take advantage of different things, different ways. So I think, you know, just kind of the blanket thing that not all of us enjoy, but actually gives us good information, is doing some form of climate survey, because oftentimes that is a place and space where people can be open, genuine, and authentic, and oftentimes do it in an anonymous way. I would say if you are doing something like a climate survey, I'm going to give a shout out to, I know Brandi's involved in ISSJ, and I know that there's a handful of people who've worked with ISSJ around here, but ISSJ is Institute for Sport and Social Justice. We're working with them through the Pac-12 right now. and they're conducting climate surveys and focus groups on all of our campuses. So having that third party, that anonymity that allows people to really be open and honest, I think is a great mechanism from a just culture, understanding culture, large perspective, and doing so in a consistent way. You can't just do it once and say, okay, this is our, this is how we understand ourselves. Because as Brandi was saying, we change, this department changed, this world as we know it is about to change very soon in college athletics. So you have to find ways to do it on a 3 to 5 year basis to just really evaluate what's working, how people are experiencing things. I'll say from a more like boots on the ground level, and if I'm understanding, Jude, you're thinking about student athletes kind of in their exit interviews or how they're taking advantage of some of those opportunities to connect. I'll start with saying, we hear this like, I have an open door policy type of mentality. Okay, well, how I describe it is if your door is open, then get the heck out the door and go where people are at. Go find people and be in their spaces where they're at. That we're familiar, our engagement with certain things, like what we're the most comfortable with, is going to be based off of our how close we are to something. Therefore, saying it's going to be really important that if you're trying to engage students and getting them to trust and give feedback, you got to be where they're at. You got to build relationships with them. Just like if you're thinking about who you trust in your life, it's taken a lot of time to build that. But now that you have that, you can connect, you can be open, you can be honest with all those different type of things. So one, getting out and being in those spaces with those students. I will then also add, sometimes call a cat what it is, call a cat by a cat, is students want to talk to people who they relate to. Students want to talk to people who they connect with. Therefore, sometimes the senior associate executive athletic director who's the sport administrator over the sport, who's conducting exit interviews, that might not be who the student is actually going to give open and honest feedback to. And that it can hurt sometimes because you're like, I'm in this position, I want people to talk to me, but that's okay. Ultimately, what you're trying to do is you're trying to just understand people's experiences. So really figuring out, maybe it is trying to create an opportunity or an exit interview process where the student gets to select who they do the exit interview with. The student gets to identify if it's a sports psychologist or a coach or someone in like a DaWon Sheridan Thomas type of position, or there's standard question, just like you would do it for an interview, but you're getting that information just as you would, it's just coming in a different way. But there's kind of that comfortability within that. So those are a few different particular examples that I would offer and how to kind of wrap your arms around and get feedback in a lot of different ways.
Thank you. Okay, so I most of the time am not a rule follower, but I'm going to try to do my best because it's not my show. So I do want to be mindful of the time. We've got time for one last question, and that belongs to Chadwick Davis, and then we will wrap this up and pass it on to our next presenter. So Chadwick, please, with your question.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for what you've been sharing. The positions that you all are in now, they are not new to universities, but they seem to be, like we've been talking about, really popular or really recently popular in athletics landscapes. What are some ways to build confidence in the DE&I efforts that we're proposing that are being implemented now? How do we make sure that going to have faith in the efforts that leaders are taking to build DE&I?
I'll say it has to live within every department. And so what happens is when it doesn't work, the DEI person is the only person that is championing DEI. And so it doesn't work because no one else is really bought in. And so from the top down, the AD, the executive team, whatever you call, the AD suite, basically, they all have to be on board, and then they all have to tell their individual units, DE&I is something that we're going to do. So marketing, make sure that when you're making posters, it's a diverse representation of our teams. Development, make sure you're going out and talking to a diverse representation of people in the community. X, Y, and Z, it has to live within every unit. That's the only way that it survives. And I think it has to be, like DaWon was talking about, it has to be in meetings. We have to address it. It should be a standing item in unit meetings, in all staff meetings, in executive council team meetings, and just a steady dose of DE&I. And I think that's how you build that confidence, because what happens is you see someone like me, my DEI stuff working, everyone's excited about that. And then our swim team does a really cool event for underrepresented students in a certain community in Tucson, and then they get excited, and now track wants to do something. It becomes contagious, and it can't just come from one person. It has to come from the top down in every individual unit, and those wins need to be celebrated. And I think that's how you build that confidence.
And I'll just jump in here quick to just add something to talk about kind of the competence and the people that are leading this work. Passion and competency are two very different things. So really making sure that the people that you're hiring to lead this, that one, obviously that they're supported and there's infrastructure to make sure, to Thomas's point, that this is baked in. I had a mentor kind of use the example or the correlation of saying, we bake compliance into quite literally every structure and process and everything that we think about. How do we think about doing the same exact thing for diversity, equity, inclusion, and give that the same exact weight? We don't want to breach or break or hurt or anything of that nature. So almost correlating compliance to DEI. It needs to be baked into everything. But back to really equipping and making sure that the people that are doing this work, I'm going to put a little plug in for diversity. Our DIECE group, Diversity, Inclusion, Equity Council of Excellence, is a group of diversity practitioners within sport that come together to just really make sure that we're supporting each other and helping each other do this work in a meaningful, intentional way. And again, moving past that passion to actual competence, which then can relate to action. So making sure that those people feel that they're supported and have the ability to grow and have influence.
All right, thanks y'all. I really appreciate your time, all of the questions. Thank you, Thomas, for putting DIECEathletics.com into the chat. Again, I would say not only based on everything that was said today, but just also some of the questions, there's more discussion that needs to be had. You know, the question, Chadwick, that you had is this topic, this area, the professionals in this space should be included and invited to a lot of our professional development opportunities throughout the NCAA and NACDA and Lead One and all of these other things. Like, we need to just start really making and creating some spaces for all of our folks that are in the diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging place. Because, you know, like Sheridan mentioned, compliance, Title IX, treat it like you would anything else. And then maybe we don't have to continue to be reactive, and it's proactive, and then it's just a part of who we are and what we do. Thank you all for your time. Thank you for the information. I'm going to say this on behalf of the panelists, that if you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to them via email, and they'd be happy to share with you any other insight that they have, any other resources that they have to share. Truly appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you today. Hopefully this was fruitful for everybody that was in this Zoom room.